I'm Bailey.
And welcome to the Math Dive in 5 for Compare and Order Fractions and Mixed Numbers for 4th grade. Go ahead and take a look at the task on your screen, and you can pause the video to complete the task with a team or a partner or even on your own. When you complete the two tasks, I want you to think about what would student learning need to look like for the students to be successful at each of these tasks. Also consider what order would you put these two tasks in.
So when we think about the progression with the best benchmarks in terms of comparing fractions, we first think about 3rd grade, and we first want to talk about plot, order, and compare whole numbers up to 10,000. Once students have a really deep understanding of whole numbers, they can then start to read and write fractions, including those fractions greater than 1, and they're going to be using the standard form, numerical form, and word form. Once students are able to represent a fraction, they can then plot, order, and compare fractional numbers with the same numerator or the same denominator.
Moving into 4th grade, students will be plotting, ordering, comparing multi-digit whole numbers up to 1,000,000, and then moving into fractions, plot, order, and comparing fractions, including mixed numbers and fractions greater than 1 with different numerators and different denominators.
Right, and then that progression continues all the way up into 5th grade. And in 5th grade, they're going to be plot, ordering, and comparing decimals to the thousandth place. And also, given a real-world problem, they'll be able to represent the division of two whole numbers as a fraction.
So for this Math 5 and 5, we're going to focus in on plot, order, and compare fractions, including mixed numbers and fractions greater than 1 with different numerators and different denominators. When students are comparing and ordering fractions and mixed numbers, we want them to have a good understanding of what a fraction is. We want them to be able to look at that concrete representational model.
Right, and once students can build and represent their fraction, they can then use number lines to compare and order fractions and mixed numbers. Once students are using those number lines, they can then use the comparison symbols. As students begin to compare fractions with models and number lines, they first need to be able to use those fraction tiles and those fraction circles to represent and build a model of those fractions. They should then be able to use those models to compare the sizes and determine which is greater than, less than, or equal to. It's really critical that students understand that when we're comparing fractions, they have to reference the same size whole.
And students can also do that using a number line, also referencing the same size whole. So they can plot their given fractions on a scaled number line, and then they compare using the greater than, less than, or equal to symbols for that number line. Benchmark fractions are another way that students can compare fractions. These are common fractions that we can compare fractions to. The benchmark fractions that we will use in 4th grade are 0, 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, and 1 whole. Manipulatives and number lines are another good way to model these benchmark fractions. We can see in the first model, they're using 1/2 as their benchmark, and you can see in the second model that 1/4 would be their benchmark.
Right, and as students begin to think about fractions abstractly, they can determine which benchmark the fraction is closest to. So if we look at some of these examples, I know that 7/12 is going to be greater than 1/2 because I know 6/12 is equal to 1/2.
So when comparing fractions using benchmarks, students can also use these benchmarks with mixed numbers. So using that same benchmarks with their whole numbers.
So if you refer back to the task number 1, students were asked to use a benchmark to compare the two fractions and to use that number line. And those two fractions were a fraction greater than 1 and a mixed number. Once students have a deep understanding of comparing fractions, they can then use those number lines to order fractions and mixed numbers with different numerators and different denominators.
Students can plot each fraction on its own scaled number line and determine which fraction is greater than or less than the fraction that they already have, and then they can put these numbers in ascending or descending order.
When students are ordering fractions with number lines, they can either decide to create a single or multiple number line for each fraction and then determine the order.
If you look back at task number 2 from the beginning, you'll see 4 different fractions, and the students will need to be ordered in order to determine who had the least amount. So when comparing and ordering fractions and mixed numbers, we can use those manipulatives, those fraction tiles, and those fraction circles. We can then move into our number lines when ordering fractions and using our benchmarks.
And once students are able to go back and forth between the concrete and representation, they can kind of start thinking about abstract and start using those comparison symbols and then using those benchmarks without drawing a model. So for example, if you think about 5/8 and 2/4, I know that 2/4 is equal to 1/2, so that and 5/8 is over 1/2, so I know that 5/8 is greater than 2/4. It's really important that students build these strong bridges between all of these islands and that they can explain their thinking in multiple different ways.
Thank you so much for joining us for our Math Dive in 5, Compare and Order Fractions and Mixed Numbers for 4th grade.
We hope to see you for our next video.
Bye.